Ever since I was old enough to speak, I've had a controller in my hands. From the Genesis all the way to the Switch, I've owned just about every console there is. So it may come as a surprise to both my viewers and my longtime friends that I've never once sat down and played a single Resident Evil game. Honestly, up until now, my only real experience with horror games has been PT, Fear, and Outlast. But as I was once again walking through those endless, looping hallways of PT earlier this year, it triggered a desire I had never really had before, something that was quite alien to me in concept. For the first time ever, I wanted to be scared. I wanted to be frightened. But having never really pursued anything in the realm of all things spooky, I was lost at where to start. So with an easy recommendation from one of my best friends who absolutely adores the series, I decided to finally pick up and play one of gaming's most renowned and beloved horror games, and play Resident Evil for the first time. Plenty of names come to mind when thinking about who the greats in horror gaming are. Silent Hill, Dead Space, Fatal Frame, and The Evil Within, just to name a few. But none have been more critically acclaimed or as long-lasting as the Resident Evil series. The first entry was released all the way back in 1996 for the original PlayStation, and immediately cemented itself as a classic when it captured the interest of its players with its fresh approach to the horror genre, eventually leading to its countless sequels and a remake in 2002. It's hard to undersell just how successful this series has been, and even though it's going on 25 years, it's still finding new ways to reinvent itself. But while it's obvious just how much of a Goliath this series has become since its first game, what is it that made Resident Evil so well received? And to answer the more important question, is its 2002 remake still worth playing almost 2 decades later? Upon my first time playing Resident Evil, I was understandably skeptical about how it would hold up visually. I mean, surely I have been spoiled by modern day games and their uncanny depictions of horror and gore that there would be no way a game that's almost old enough to drink could possibly impress me. But I have to say, after only a few minutes spent in the opening section, it was becoming very obvious to me why this game and series has maintained its diehard fanbase so intensely over the years. The atmosphere of Resident Evil is horror perfection, from the dim candlelit rooms of the mansion to the washed-out, pale industrial lighting of the laboratories and basements. Everything culminates into an experience that rips you right out of reality and straight into this hopeless and depressing world. The graveyard crypt in the early section of the game is a perfect example of this. As I made my way down into the crypt for the first time and saw the chained coffin suspended in the air, I was petrified and couldn't decide whether or not to grab the book that was resting below it for fear of what might happen next. This ever-looming sense of doom pervades every minute of Resident Evil, with the way environments are cleverly designed to invoke fear, locking the camera to a fixed position and hiding whatever may be lurking behind each corner. Its very unique art style perfectly captures the game's mood and tone, with Resident Evil achieving this ambiance by utilizing a combination of 2D background images and 3D light maps. Now, going about designing environments in this way was obviously a method used to make the game perform well on its initial release console, the PlayStation, but I truly believe it benefited from this limitation, as with both the original and this remake, it gave the developers an opportunity to deliver an unrivaled atmosphere that could never be achieved with a player-controlled camera. Having the camera locked to one viewpoint meant that I was always filled with absolute dread and anxiety every time I blindly rounded a corner or reached the edge of the frame, never knowing what I might run into next. These visual constraints led to the very charming hand-painted look that the artists have crafted the environments in, but also leads to what is my only real gripe with the graphics: the characters. While the player, companion, and enemy models certainly look great and are very highly detailed, given that they are the only 3D rendered objects in the game, it does lead to a bit of a disconnect where characters look almost too crisp and contrast far too greatly with the more smudgy, hand-drawn backgrounds they exist in. This is a very small complaint, however, as the enemy designs are excellent and downright terrifying. Zombies, Crimson Heads, and the Hellhounds known as Cerberus all have some great designs to them, but it's the more challenging enemies and bosses that really stand out. The giant serpent known as Yawn and the hunters and chimeras are as grimy and disgusting as you'd hope, and their putrid appearance makes them all the more horrific each time you encounter them. My absolute favorite design, though, is Lisa Trevor, a disturbing shell of a human whose grotesque visuals are completely reinforced once you find out her chilling backstory, making her confusing mess of flesh all the more unpleasant. Overall, I couldn't be any more pleased with the way this game looks, and honestly, in many cases, I prefer this type of curated art style significantly more than something that just tries to be as visually impressive and realistic as modern hardware will allow. The hardware limitations of older systems have impacted more than just the visuals of Resident Evil. Some of these aspects benefit from those constraints, but many suffer as well. This is immediately apparent right from the start. As you leave the first room of the mansion, you're greeted with the loading screen of that door being opened. I was actually quite entertained by this for the first couple hours of play, since it slowed down the pace as I entered a new room, giving more than enough time to build suspense and fear for what lies on the other side. But this thrill quickly wore out its welcome, as the further you progress through the game, the more often you find yourself backtracking through these doors that all require the action to come to a screeching standstill, creating only frustration. That frustration is then amplified by the fixed cameras I mentioned earlier. When moving your character between one view to the next, there is a rather disorienting moment of confusion as your brain scrambles to adjust the thumbstick to the new perspective, and it's something that even by the end of the game, I never really got used to. In general, the game controls just fine as long as you are staying in the same frame. Obviously, a full aiming system for weapons wouldn't make much sense with the fixed view, so aiming functions in 360 degrees, almost like a top-down shooter with the added benefit of aiming high, low, or chest level. Having a simpler but less accurate aiming system pairs quite nicely with the cramped hallways and cluttered room designs, leading to some really intense enemy encounters that feel very rewarding when you finally kill off that last enemy with the satisfying splatter of a headshot. The game's calmer moments of puzzle solving offer a much needed break from the frantic and stressful action sequences. Resident Evil's more archaic design is a welcome one here, as the puzzles never once try to hold your hand. In fact, I'd often find myself pulling out a pen and paper just to take notes on some of the more complicated clues. Some might argue that this creates too many moments of complete confusion and headache, as some players may find these riddles too difficult, but I found that if you keep a keen eye and pay attention to the clues you're given, you'll find that most puzzles offer a good brain teaser while not being completely unsolvable without the help of a Google search. Most of this more retro approach to game design is quite charming and added significantly to the game's terror and intensity, but where Resident Evil truly shines is with its combined mechanics of health, ammo, and inventory management that give this game its genre-defining feature: survival horror. When you first start the game, you'll get the option of selecting between Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, which definitely have their differences, but mostly just acts as a difficulty selector, as there are only minor differences between the two playthroughs. The main distinction between the two is that Jill is slower with less health, but has 8 inventory slots and a lockpick, while Chris is faster and has more health, but only has 6 slots and a lighter. Being this is my first time playing Resident Evil, I picked Jill and selected medium difficulty, and I'm glad I did. Right out of the gate, I struggled hard with the inventory system and can't imagine having played through with 2 less slots. Now, you can put away items for safekeeping to be accessed from any of the game's storage chests, but it certainly remained as one of the most defining traits of Resident Evil, as inventory management is a constant balancing act of deciding which 8 items will be most important to have until you can make it to the next chest. While I wasn't quite fond of smaller key items each taking an entire inventory slot, it does make the mechanics stand out, since it really kept me on my toes and enhanced the survival aspects on display. Juggling between which of the game's handful of firearms to carry and use, or even deciding to just dodge attacks completely to conserve ammo, but risk losing health, became not only an important choice, but one of absolute necessity with how limited both ammo, first aid, and inventory space are. You are allotted 2 dedicated slots for one-time use items like a dagger or taser, which did offer a small amount of comfort to the otherwise stressful carrying capacity, but these are mostly just there for a last resort if you find yourself getting cornered by a zombie. The restricted inventory resulted in fights always remaining interesting for me, and the scarce ammo made me use weapons I normally might not have. This is especially true as you progress through the game and enemies you killed before are reanimated as Crimson Heads, as well as the introduction of quicker and harder enemies like the Neptunes, Hunters, and Chimera, which add a bit of flavor to the combat just as you're starting to get comfortable. Now, I am going to briefly touch on the final boss encounter here, so if you haven't played the game and want to avoid any spoilers, skip ahead to the marked time. The restrictive movement and combat always made confrontations challenging and exciting, making the only time I ever found combat to be not only too easy, but honestly boring, is during the final boss encounter, where the tight, cramped hallways were replaced with a wide, open arena and a giant, slow-moving enemy known as the Tyrant. It essentially stripped away all the restrictions that made the action from the rest of the game so intense and terrifying by leaving you with far too much room for mobility and an enemy that's far too easy to dodge. Honestly, the only reason it was even memorable was because of a cramped encounter with the same boss right beforehand and an over-the-top RPG set piece at the end of the second sequence. So outside of combat, another aspect of the survival mechanics that I really enjoyed was the way game saves were treated. Instead of being able to just save and quit whenever you want, you would have to not only locate a typewriter, but use an ink ribbon with it, which proved to be quite stressful due to the game's limited locations of both. It does make it a bit of a hard sell for modern day gaming, since a quick 15 to 30 minute session becomes a waste of a whole ink ribbon, but I think the choice of deciding when is and isn't the right time to save really adds to Resident Evil's mechanics, especially when you take into account the game's lack of a checkpoint system. Yes, you heard me right. If you die, you will have to go all the way back to your last save point, making that initial decision of when you save all the more crucial. It's honestly interesting how so many of these choices would normally be seen as bad game design, but in the context of Resident Evil, they all work together to really hammer home that endless despair that permeated my entire playthrough. While I certainly found the survival horror aspects to be cumbersome and stressful at first, it was that sense of problem solving and inventory management that eventually won me over, and why it is so deserving of coining that title. Resident Evil is a game that is more than deserving of the hype that surrounds it. Even though much of its game design is desperately aged and outdated, it's the clever uses of old technology it was built for that offer a memorable experience worthy of the survival horror label it helped coin. Even though the load screens and fixed cameras cause a handful of frustrations, the meticulous use of mood and ambiance combined with intelligent map and puzzle design create such a fear-invoking environment that it would be hard to find something more memorable. While the survival mechanics can seem like a burden at first, their implementation means that even the most standard of encounters are just as tense and stressful as the last. Resident Evil is a great first entry into what is arguably horror gaming's best series. Every cog in the machine perfectly comes together to make one of the most memorable titles in not just horror, but all of gaming, and one whose remake still holds up surprisingly well almost 2 decades later. I can't believe I'm saying this, but wow, Resident Evil blew me away. It's clear as day to me now why people swear by this series, and I'm glad I was finally able to experience it. So yeah, it's safe to say that Resident Evil showed me a good time, and I think I'll continue playing this series. But now I want to hear from you. What is your favorite Resident Evil game, or do you even like horror games at all? Let me know in the comments below, and then make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and then hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. If you want to hear more of my mild gaming takes, hit me up on Twitter or Instagram, and with that, I've been the name's Jer. Thanks for watching. See you later!